Okay.
All right.
Good evening, Jesse.
Good evening, PJ.
And for those who don't know me, my name is PJ Gunter. And I've been around the block a few times, few years. I am a licensed religious science practitioner at Jesse Center, Creative Life. I'm very excited to be here tonight with Jesse. We are going to talk about some history, the history of money, and specifically the history of African Americans in this country in personal finance. So a little bit about what I bring this evening, my perspective. It was formed historically from being a little girl raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a segregated housing environment, housing project. And from there, I went on to school. And then by the time I got my first master's degree, I didn't know what I didn't know about money. And so I was just so financially illiterate that I went everywhere to try to learn about money. I went to a personal financial planner, and I just love her to this day. And she said, honey, you got to get out of debt first, with that Texas accent. And so she couldn't help me because I had so much debt. And then I went to a psychologist, and a psychologist was not trained in personal finance. They were as illiterate as I was, and they couldn't help me. And about that time, home buying courses started cropping up around different places in Houston. So I went everywhere I could, just hungering and thirsting after knowledge about personal finance. And it led me to the Foundation for Financial Literacy, which has since disbanded. And so I got a chance to learn a little bit more under I guess that was Bush II administration. In fact, we contributed to one of the fiscal responsibility elements of that administration, because the man who owned the company at the time that housed the Foundation for Financial Literacy was very tight with the Bush administration. So really, my journey has been long. It is still incomplete, and it in many ways represents the history of African Americans and personal finance in this country. I am now an accredited financial counselor, and that's a designation through the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education. And I've been doing that, oh my goodness, probably for almost 25 or 30 years. I've been a part of that association. My biggest takeaway with what I've learned in personal finance is you never know it all. Just got to keep learning, got to keep growing. I'm currently enrolled in a cryptocurrency course. So, I know very little, pretty much as little as I knew about money when I first began the quest. But I do want to know more about cryptocurrency. So I'm taking another class. Just can't take too much. So that's enough about me. Jesse?
Well, PJ is also the co-director of our Be the Change initiative with Sandy Newkirk at Creative Life, which has been meeting since the George Floyd murder and folded into itself these soul sessions, which have been happening since, I think, early 2017. And in these soul sessions, we meet and discuss matters of social justice. So, PJ, is most of your work with private clients?
Some of my work is with private clients. I do that. And I also do a lot of group work. I teach more than I work one-on-one with private clients. And I tell you what, as we go through the evening, I was really giving this a whole lot of thought, Jesse. And I'd like this conversation to be more like driving a car, driving anything. We have to keep our eyes on the road, or we'll crash into something or someone. And at the same time, we have to watch what's on either side of us. And as Sandy likes to say, Sandy Newkirk, stay in my lane. I'm going to stay on Sandy lane. That's what she says. So, and it's also important, as most of us who are drivers know, it's important to check that rear view mirror. And we have to check it pretty frequently. It helps to see what's behind us. You know, we can't stay focused on the rear view mirror unless we're backing up, and then we don't use the rear view mirror, you know, unless you got one of these high class cars with all the technology that shows you where you're backing up. You know, you look out the rear window instead of the rear view mirror. I guess what I'm really trying to say is we can make progress by being aware of where we are and then glancing back as we continue to move forward. We have to move forward. History lets us know where we've been, and where we are is not even where we're going. However, right now, Jesse, we seem to be stuck. Policies have not changed. Redlining has not changed. The transfer of wealth is getting deeper and deeper and more frequent than ever before. So to me, where we are feels more like quicksand than pavement, because we keep sinking deeper and deeper. So I'd like us, as I said, to focus more on where we are and where we're going rather than where we've been, although we have to glance at that rear view mirror just to make sure we keep the car where it's supposed to be. Safe.
Okay. Well, I've got a question for you that has to do with the rear view mirror.
Okay.
And the question is, how much of the quicksand issue and everything leading up to it in your lifetime and your parents and their parents' lifetimes, how much of that was driven by the capitalist model that was founded in the colonialist model, where stakeholders, shareholders are the first to be satisfied before management, before certainly labor, where whole industries are driven by the investments of people outside of those industries who have money to spare and put a greater priority on a return on their investments than they do on the human factor.
Oh boy, that's a great place to start. We'll have to focus on the rear view mirror, not just take a glance at it to get into that. So actually, in my opinion, a lot of this is my opinion based on a lot of the stuff I've read. That's a two-pronged, maybe even more, but majorly two-pronged issue. And part of it has to do with education. It's the presence of education and the lack of education. Also, the denial of education, which is present in the very oppression of a people. So it's education. And then it's also access to capital. Now, one of the very interesting things I found when I was doing research for our talk, I had never seen African slaves pictured on currency. It actually moved me emotionally to see the pictures of African slaves on Confederate paper money. So in part, the answer to that would be that enslaved people were both chattel, they were property, viewed as property, and they were also collateral. In many cases, enslaved people were mortgaged and used for credit, just to get credit, so that plantation owners and people who traded in the marketing and selling of human commodity, I hate using that term, but that's the way it was. They collateralized the very people they were buying and selling. So it was an international issue, an international trade. It was not really frowned upon because human beings were considered as property and had no rights. Yet these same human beings, the intelligence within these same human beings was recognized as intelligence. And so they were denied education, supposedly so that they could remain happily enslaved.
Because had they received education, they would have become a threat in the sense of competition in a free market.
Well, you know, Haiti gained their independence when they learned that's the key word. When they learned they could live differently, they didn't have to be enslaved. And in many ways, that's why Haiti is still somewhat economically, well, it is economically oppressed to this day. That's part of the quicksand, even though Haiti is independent of any other country. It's a sovereign nation. But yes, so that's a paradox, Jesse. On the one hand, you're saying these human beings are 3/5 human, denying them humanity. Yet on the other hand, you're recognizing that these are intelligent beings capable of learning and charting their own path. So how do you balance that type of conundrum?
Was the 3/5 determination that an African American, that an African American slave was 3/5 of a person, was that, and I'm assuming it is, that was motivated to prevent a sizable voting bloc in the Jim Crow era?
The 3/5 human disappeared when the 13th Amendment was ratified. So, in other words, once people were no longer legally enslaved, then they acquired the right to vote with one of the other amendments, the 13th, 14th, or 15th made, it got rid of slavery. They just didn't want human beings recognizing the innate intelligence that we know from the science of mind and spirit. They did not want these people to be educated so they could chart their own destiny. That's really what it was all about. And there were many, many uprisings about that. And I do want to point out that the eradication of slavery did not eliminate enslavement practices.
Right.
So I think one important thing I really want to point out here is practices can be legislated. Policies and practices can be legislated. Those practices only come with a change in consciousness, transformation in consciousness. So what I'm saying here is we have all these we have some policies on the books. We have some laws on the books. Those laws are not followed and enacted because the change in consciousness has yet to occur. So, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to go out and vote for people who at least say they are going to try to do something about writing new laws and legislation to change things. We all know that it does take a transformation in consciousness to change this culture. Laws will not be enough. Laws are not enough when you go to apply for a job and somebody sees your name and identifies it as an African American name, and then you don't get the job. Laws are not enough when you go to rent an apartment and they tell you, oh, we just rented it because you show up and you're Black. I had a very difficult time trying to lease property here where I live. Very, very difficult. And it's 1% Black where we are. And I can't prove it, but I definitely wonder how much racial discrimination came to bear when I was trying to find a place to live.
Well, there's a code word, that unconscious white people use, and it's called that element. 2 words. We're concerned about that element. And if someone like you, PJ, presents yourself as the beautiful soul that you are, you'll be told, well, you're not like the others, so we'll let you in because you're we've vetted you, look closely into you, but who stands behind you, we're going to assume is a great mass of troubled and troublesome people. That's the story that white people tell themselves, who are unconscious and who are based in greed.
And some of that element, the education of that element, came from the miseducation of that element. And in fact, one of the resources I used was Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro. During the time I was referring to earlier, the education part, the education time, African Americans were sorely miseducated. And a lot of that miseducation came from the Bible. They used certain phrases, certain verses in the Bible, slaves, obey your masters, and that kind of thing, and to educate enslaved people. So that when African Americans were denied the opportunity to become educated, one thing they could do was read the Bible. They were limited to reading the Bible, and so in only certain parts of the Bible. Many of the preachers they selected to lead the flock, so to speak, were not only uneducated but miseducated, which I think is worse than being uneducated. So a lot of that, the education into the element, as you're referring to, and what people are talking about today, crime and not taking care of things or whatever they say. There goes the neighborhood once somebody Black moves into a neighborhood. That was part of the miseducation of the Negro, which was, to quote Carter G. Woodson, I'm not saying it's not, I'm saying that it's perpetual and it was perpetuated, and that you have to realize what you don't know before you can learn what you need to know.
Yeah. I remember Donald John Lewis saying, and he may have been quoting someone, or this may have been out of his own soul, but he said, if you make a man go round to the back door often enough, he'll go round to it himself on his own.
That's pretty much a
Yeah.
quote from Carter G. Woodson.
Is it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it,
That you
it
just,
is.
yeah. I wondered, I wondered how long it would take us in this conversation to bring religion into it, Western religion into it, because I sit here boiling at the thought and remembering what Reverend Ronnie Lister shared with us about Howard Thurman and about his Howard Thurman's mother's reaction to Paul in the Bible. She says, "Don't read me, Paul, with the business about slaves obey your masters." And what doesn't get brought up is that when that was written, what that was meant to say is vastly different than how it was used. It was meant to the early Christian church. It was saying, if you're a slave in the Roman Empire, behave yourself and keep a low profile and do what they tell you to do so that you don't draw problems to everyone else. And also that slavery in the Roman Empire was a path to citizenship. It was more like an apprenticeship. It was not abject generational slavery like we've seen in the slave trade and in the development of this hemisphere. And yet religion has been complicit every step of the way, and specifically Christianity in supporting these systems, Christianity and capitalism. And yet there's beauty and majesty in both of them that can be reclaimed in some way.
They can, and I'm glad you brought that up, Jesse, because religion has been used repeatedly. When Dr. King first came to prominence, he had been doing his work, and all of the people, I just pay homage to all of the people who came before him who did phenomenal work just as much as Dr. King did. When he first started talking about integration, I'd like us to look at that word, integration. It comes from the root word integer, which means whole and complete within itself. So the aim of integration was way more than eliminating segregation. Whoever got a hold of those ideals, not just ideas, but ideals, redefined that entire movement to mean racial integration. Racial integration is just a fraction of the entire wholeness and completeness of what we know the one to be, the unification of all in all as individualized expressions of God. That's the part of me that's the practitioner. And so I just see how they took that entire movement that Dr. King got started with so eloquently and just whittled it down to a fraction of what it was supposed to mean, when really it meant economic, it meant political, it meant housing, it meant becoming one, not just a part of society or apart from society, which is still the case to this day. So religion has been used and misused to miseducate African Americans.
The idea comes to mind. Yeah, it's integer, and I'm coming up too with integrity.
Ooh.
Integrity, where what that says to me is that, like, within a community or within a given sphere, at any point in that sphere, there are the same core values. There's the same expectation of human and a humane response. This is not maybe a good example, but it's like if you go to a CSL center, one of our centers that we participate in, anywhere on earth, you're going to hear terms like spiritual mind treatment, meditation, they're gonna quote from certain books more than others, principally those of Ernest Holmes, and this kind of thing. And you can expect that. Um, my uncle, who was a Roman Catholic pre-Vatican II, when the Mass was still in Latin, so you could go to any Catholic church on earth, and you hear exactly the same thing on that particular Sunday of the month. To me, what this is saying is like in a setting of a society that's in integrity with itself, neighbors are going to care for neighbors. The old will look after the young. Okay. People are going to loan money. People are going to borrow money. And it's going to be a business transaction, but it's also going to have a merciful aspect to it, not turn into the company store. There's not going to be usury. And these aggressive 30% APRs that you're seeing us approaching now. And there's going to be dignity. And there's going to be respect. And there's certain things that are going to have to be earned by the individual, like leadership, like power, real power, not phony manipulative power. But you're going to have to, if you want to be a brain surgeon, you got to go to medical school, that kind of stuff.
Right.
You have multiple advanced degrees that bear on your work, that give what you say both some authority, although most of that comes just through your presentation of yourself, but they give you credentials and they give you kind of a platform off which to work. So that kind of stuff is going to have to be earned. But overall, throughout the whole community, there's going to be this baseline of respect. And if I can rant for just a moment more, this is something I don't see this. I don't see this being taught. You speak of a religious miseducation. I don't see this being effectively taught in New Thought from a financial perspective, because our literature is aimed at upper middle class people.
True.
Regardless of ethnicity, because it's written in kind of an approachable way and not specific even to necessarily North America, but it's aimed at people excuse me, who want to move from driving a $25,000 car to a $60,000 car, who want to add a room on the nice house they have, and on and on. And where does it leave the shift worker? Where does it leave the garage mechanic? Where does it leave the people who provide the backbone for industry? It addresses itself to capital and management, and the management that wishes to become capital, but it does not address itself to labor. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that that's totally true, which is part of the reason why I was so financially illiterate until I was about 40. I mean, just learning. I tell you, my dad had a statement. I can still remember it. He used to say, "My credit is bad enough to stand up and fight you." He did. And I can still hear him saying that. There was a lot of truth in it. And there was a lot of pain in that statement at the same time. He knew how to take his pain and turn it into something laughable. And so you're right. He was a laborer. I proudly say my dad sent 4 kids to college on a janitor's salary. My mother was a teacher, but it's almost unheard of for 4 kids born in the 50s, African American kids, to all have at least a bachelor's. We all 4 have that, and 2 of us have advanced degrees, and 2 of us have been officers in the U.S. Air Force. So that's quite remarkable for a family to come up the way we came up. So I give a lot of honor to, shouts out to my parents. You're right, the language. In fact, David Kruger wrote a book called The Secret Language of Money. there is a whole language that is totally secret. Now, one other thing I want to mention before our time gets away, Jesse, is one day I was wandering in the bookstore when I first started coming to Creative Life. And I walked in the door and there's this book on the shelf and it just jumped in my arms. I love books, but that one jumped into my arms. It was called The Trance of Scarcity.
Yeah.
And David Dewhurst, our own very own David Dewhurst, and Marsha Lehman taught a course on that 2 or 3 years ago, a few years back, they taught that course. So the book itself is extremely on point. It's by Victoria Castle. And one of the things you might be interested to know that Aristotle had 6 pillars. Let me see if I can find that. I can't share my screen. Well, maybe I could. I don't know. Aristotle defined one of the elements or one of the components of money as being scarce. And when we sit with that it is meant to be scarce, it sets up the fear of not having it and the desire of acquiring it above all else. You just want to get it. So it looks like there, with scarcity built into what money really, the definition of money, then we can look at money not only as a means to an end and a medium of exchange, but an end within itself. And many people look at it not either or, but both ways, unwittingly. A lot of people who are just get money for the purpose, the sake of getting money, they don't realize that acquiring money to them is acquiring it as a means within itself, not just as a means of acquisition. It's almost to the point where I wonder how many people know that they are using that the slogan on money, "In God We Trust," as the very God we serve, because so many people will do anything for money. And that's what there was a bank that was established early on when the freedmen first became emancipated. It was called the Freedmen's Bank. It was set up by some former slaves or enslaved people. And eventually Frederick Douglass was appointed to run it. And he ran an audit and found that the money was not being used the way it was supposed to be used. You see, we seem to, African Americans, when African Americans were first freed, it's important to realize the vulnerable position they were in. They had lost land, language. In case you don't know, I speak English as a second language. Many people wonder about Ebonics and why African Americans speak English in such a broken way. Well, for African Americans, English is a second language. We didn't come here speaking English. I think many of us do very well with it, even though it's not our primary tongue. So land, language, and culture we lost. So to go back to the Freedmen's Bank, you know how little children cannot discern, haven't been on the planet long enough to know A from B or Jack from Jill. They have no idea. African Americans were in the same position. Whatever they were told, they believed. And because it came from someone who had been portrayed in pictures as being God himself, they accepted it as true. So once they accepted it as truth, they acted upon it. They were told that if they put their deposits in this Freedmen's Bank, that those deposits would be available for them to buy homes and to use as currency. And the bank itself had a clause in it, the constitution of the bank, the founding principles of the bank had a clause in it that they could change it. It was initially a savings bank. They changed it to become an investment bank. And then the owners of the Freedmen's Bank took the deposits and then invested it, lost all the money, closed the bank down, and nobody could get their money back out of that institution. That's one of the reasons African Americans don't trust banks to this day. And then when you go back and you look in recent times, as recent as 2008, with the subprime lending fiasco, many African Americans had those subprime loans and lost their homes. So it's just been over and over a principle, a practice of telling lies, misleading, miseducating. Then you have people who buy into that, lose everything, are fearful and distrusting, and it just leads the whole economy into chaos. Do you know that a mind really is a terrible thing to waste, to use the United Negro College Fund's slogan, giving them credit for that? What would this world be like if we did truly integrate economically and we allowed everyone who individualizes the presence of God to apply the power of their mind to this economy? The oppression, we've got to get to a point where we look at the participation of everybody, including African Americans, as a means to make this society better, instead of, oh, Jews will not replace us. Oh, Blacks will not replace us. Nobody can replace anyone else. Altogether, we are one. And if we all came together and used the individualized intelligence we have within us to make this economy better, then we would have a wonderful place to live. Instead, we come from a place of scarcity. Oh, I ain't got enough. I ain't got enough to share. I ain't got enough to give. Oh no, you can't have mine. I'm going to hoard my little pennies over here, so you can't have any. And when we do that, the money is no longer currency. It becomes stagnant. It does not grow. And I'm on my rant right now.
No, go on.
Looking at redlining, for example, and the housing crisis. When I guess I'm assuming that people listening understand what goes on in redlining. Somebody at one point literally took a red pen and blocked off a section of a map and said, this is where the coloreds are going to live. And then that property in that part of town was devalued. So the loans weren't as big, or people were denied loans. The property values declined. And when schools are based on property taxes and the property taxes aren't as high, then the quality of the schools is not as good. So everybody loses in a situation like that. If we really want our economy to grow and flourish beyond all these illusions of inflation, then everybody has to participate. NPR came out with a study. They didn't do the study, but they broadcast the study that was done by Citibank. Citibank says that the cost of racism in the US economy is $16 trillion because of discrimination. 13 trillion lost in potential business revenue. 2.7 trillion lost in income due to disparities in wages suffered by African Americans. 218 billion lost over just the past 2 decades in providing housing credit, and 90 billion to 113 billion lost in lifetime discrimination from higher education. So you see, the cost of discrimination, not even to mention the cost of the capable, brilliant minds we could be harnessing. There may be even a solution to climate change within these minds that are suppressed and oppressed because of the fear within the trance of scarcity. I'm done, Rand.
No. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot, and you don't have to give me an answer, but I'd love for you to lead a class on the trance of scarcity and any other books that you want to bring in support of that model. But yeah, I mean, scarcity from a spiritual standpoint, we know it's bogus. We live in a universe where you cannot count the grains of sand on the beach. You cannot count the blades of grass, so on. So we know that it's not an absolute thing. We know that goods and services are valued, theoretically anyway, based on the number of worker hours that go into their creation, or the difficulty of finding them, like diamonds and gold. This is why these things are so, because they're not out in your yard. You have to, well, the idea that white people are entitled is what's back of all of this to me. The idea that a certain ethnicity, Northern European people who present of a Northern European ethnic identity, present themselves in that form. That money that you spoke of, those trillions of dollars, they're not lost. They're in other people's pockets. They're in other countries' defense budgets. They're in petrochemical industries. You know what I'm saying? It's like the money has been generated. It's just not getting to the people. It's just not being equitably shared. And there's the whole idea of wealth inequality as being baked into the system is something that we in New Thought have not been willing to admit. You probably were told, and all of us are told, I was told when I came into this teaching, you can prosper. Read Catherine Ponder, read this, reprogram your subconscious mind and you can prosper. And if any of us put our hand up and said, well, I'm working in a system that's rigged against me, we'd be told, well, that's negative thinking. Just don't worry about what everybody else is up to or how the system looks, because you're the one who now has this prized information and you can use this. But David Spangler's book that I did this series on a few months ago, he points out, he says, all genuine wealth is collaborative. It's all societal. It's all part of, it flows past your door. You don't hold it. You don't possess it. You use it and you pass it on. I get a paycheck, I put some in the bank, I go buy some things with it, and the people I buy the stuff from, it turns into their paycheck, and they go and on and on and on. And somewhere back of it, there's somebody who's kind of at a distance from these transactions, and they're dipping, as they say in The Sopranos, they're dipping their beak. They're taking they're taking their cut because they invested in all of this. And I don't know really what I'm trying to say here, except that the system is broken, and racism is a huge part of it. And I kind of think, though, that even if racism didn't exist, that the system would not work. The system of absentee ownership through capital investment. If somebody decides to open a restaurant, and I decide I eat there, and I like it. And I want to help them. I'm going to invest some money in that restaurant. Okay. I don't have to cook the food. I don't have to serve the tables. I don't have to do anything. I've just invested some money. The person who owns that restaurant, I'm going to be on the top of their list of repayment. They're going to be more concerned about what I do because A, they owe me the money, and B, they know that they can come back to me for more money should they need it. So they're going to be more concerned about how I feel about things than they are even how the customer is going to feel about their food, or how the people who, and much more so than the people who work there, feel about their job. And there's something intrinsically wrong with that.
Hear what you're saying. You're talking about investing
Yeah,
and the way it works
the
with
way it works.
shareholders getting their money back before I get a product. You know, I mean, so much stuff now. I'm probably too old to even talk about any of this, but so much is just not what I know it to be. The quality in products, you know, you buy something, it has a 5-month shelf life, and then you got to go and replace it. But the shareholders get paid every single time I buy another one of those products. So I see what you mean, and it's not helpful, and it's unsustainable.
Yeah.
It's time to end these discriminatory practices that compromise the very nature of the economy we have. You know, there was a time when we were known as citizens. You might remember that.
Mm,
We went from citizens to consumers.
exactly.
From citizens to consumers. And I contend that we are creators because we are made and fashioned after the very image of the creator. And when people are denied an opportunity to create, then that creation is suppressed, and it's got to come out.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't come out in constructive ways. It comes out in some of those ways you're talking about. And I think that investors also suffer from the lack of creating, because we're all made in that image, made to create. So it's if we don't, we have to elect people who are at least willing to look at some of the policies and the processes and the practices, the laws that are on the books, and be willing to change that, be willing to change the perspective, be willing to transform into something that allows more people to contribute and create in this society, so that we can all grow as the one we are supposed to be. So I don't want it to sound like I have all the answers and that, you know, I'm practicing, I'm a practitioner. I practice the science of mind and spirit. I don't have it totally together. So I would like to get to a point where I myself can begin to see other people as creators, not as people who are going to discriminate. You know, I want to tell a story about when I first graduated from college. I had worked at TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, while I was in high school. And I was in a secretarial pool. When I got my degree, they refused to hire me in a professional level position. They told me that I could stay in the pool indefinitely because I typed about 95 words a minute on an electric typewriter. You might remember those.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the Selectric.
The Selectric.
Had the little ball in the middle.
And it corrected the correcting Selectric. It was as good as it was ever going to get, right? That was the pinnacle of technology.
Right, with carbon paper and the whole works. And I hope there are some people watching, and maybe even the recording, who don't remember carbon paper. Anyway, I did get the degree. TVA refused to hire me. And I applied I thought it was okay. I thought, okay, I have this degree. I can do things. I know some stuff and a few things. So I went down to Nashville and I applied for a job at, I think it was the Baptist Convention at the time. I applied to edit some of their newsletters. And so, I could have done that. I could have done it very well. Well, I know today that I was discriminated against. The one thing I really firmly remember is that they had the word grammar misspelled on the ad. It was GRAMMER. And so I scratched it out after I got the rejection letter. I scratched it out and sent it back to them and corrected it. And, at the time, I could not put together the discrimination and the discrimination in the job market, because the EEOC was out and said that there would be no discrimination. So what I'm really getting at is what we have on the books is one thing. What is practiced is something else. And states of consciousness cannot be legislated. So we have to really get to a point where we are willing to accept our differences as positive, and that we don't even want the same things. You don't want what I want. I don't want what you want. It's all something different. So everybody, we will all grow when we all come together as the integer, as the one unified body we are intended to be.
I don't want what you want, but I want you to have what you want. I passionately want you to have what you want. And I want you to want me to have what I want, because we're not in competition, because there is no basic scarcity. And so what you want and what I want are basically matters of personal style, just general kind of affinity. You pick the clothing that you wear today. You select the things that you fill your home with, and so on. That's beautiful. I have a question for you. I realize that we're pushing the time limit here, which this hour has just like flown by.
It has.
And this is a really big question, and it might take another soul session really to. And it is this: how does a redlined community get investment to build the infrastructure to thrive and to have its people thrive without being gentrified?
That's one I don't have an answer for. Without being gentrified. What I can say is that we're in an election season. You elect people who are willing to change those red lines, to eliminate the red lines. And then you find lenders and you find realtors and others who are willing to go beyond. One thing I learned, I saw a movie in Boulder a few weeks ago. It was called This Is Not Who We Are. Boulder is portrayed as this liberal mecca, and Boulder at one point had redlined the city of Boulder that relegated African Americans to 4 blocks within the city. It was such that people were building houses on the property in their parents' backyards. Couldn't buy property outside of that. So that just kind of blew the lid off that, the cover off of Boulder's liberal image. Redlining does affect voting. The property within the redlined districts is usually of a lower value. The answers are in the voting booth. So I think that would help. Again, though, we have to change minds. We have to change souls. It's not going to be, it's the change is not going to happen on this level.
Yeah. I know in Galveston County, they redistricted. A lot of places have been redistricting. And an African-American man who was representing out of Texas City was representing Galveston Island as well. Well, no longer. And yeah, so yeah, it takes a change to heart, you know, and I've seen this happen on an individual level in the course of my long ministry, where I've met overtly out front racist white people who have changed basically before my eyes, and they have changed, and they've changed for good. I mean, it's something I trust the change that I see. And what's happened, how that has happened is twofold. One is they've gone to the source of their own being, where there is one life, and that life is God, and that life is all the life there is. And that has welled up within them. And the other thing that's happened, probably as a function of the first thing, is that they've been around people unlike themselves and realized we're way more the same than we're not. And again, the differences between us are historical in the past, and they're about affinity, which is irrelevant in the long run. You know, it's a matter of personal style and so on. But it's like, and they think, now I have this wealth of friends. Now I'm comfortable in environments I was not comfortable in before. And so basically it's good for my chi, you know, my heart has opened in this. And I watched this happen. What doesn't seem to work is to pull people up by the lapels and tell them this has to happen for them, because people get defensive and bound up and flag waving, and they you know, they want no part of it. It's the conversation that we've had about these soul sessions that we really feel that most of the people watching these things are completely in sync with what we're, and could as easily, we could swap out our roles with theirs, you know what I'm saying? And they could come in and say pretty much the same things because we're all pretty much on the same page. My fond hope, and yours too, I know, PJ, is that somebody out there is going to watch this and say, wait a minute, you know, I never thought of that. And I need to do things differently in my life. I need to look at some things and how it's all tied together. And you bring up climate change, and it's like everything I'm reading about climate change says that the people that it's going to hurt the most are the dispossessed and the disenfranchised and the poor, you know, in particularly Africa and Asia and the island nations and a place like Haiti, where everything that could go wrong has gone wrong, where they've had act of God after act of God, and insurrection and violence and gang warfare and everything else as a result of the crushing poverty that they have, and the fact that nothing has ever been done about it by France. You know, it all ties in together, and it can seem at times hopeless and crushing. And I can only imagine what it feels like to an African-American woman.
All of that's true. Every bit of that. Only thing I would preface that is by saying, in the beginning, climate change will affect them more, because we are all on one earth, and there is no way that you can set off a nuclear bomb anywhere on the planet today and I don't breathe that air tomorrow.
Right.
It's the same air, it's the same water, and we are defiling it, and it was put here from the beginning. So we have to see ourselves as one. Despite the history, we have to complement each other with an E, complement with an E, because we complete each other as one. So again, as we end up, we are moving forward with an eye on the rear view mirror. We want to make sure of where we're going, and we have to be in touch with where we've been.
It has been such a joy being with you tonight, as it always is. And we meet on the first Wednesdays of the month, this committee, and select. And our next presenter is going to be Rita Wiltz, the founder of Children's Books on Wheels, and a hugely impactful leader in the Tamina community, her home, which is a freedman's town, an ancestral freedman's town in Montgomery County, Texas, and she's just a huge presence throughout the county and really throughout this whole part of the state in terms of bringing education, support, material supply, healthcare, and children's books. It's funny because she's into so much, and it comes under the heading of children's books, which I think is sweet and beautiful. Anyway, she's going to be with us on a Wednesday in November, or she's going to be with us in November. I'm not sure what date. Where Danielle is checking on that now. Anyhow, PJ, it's been awesome to work with you tonight, and I look forward to us doing this again. And I do hope too that you'll think about doing a class for our center and beyond for the world on the trance of scarcity, or whatever resources you pull together to speak about equity in finance and in society and in life. Love you bunches.
Love you too.
Lisa, do we have questions? Reverend Lisa Ryan?
No, there's been a lot in the chat, but mostly us posting all of the books and movies that you've suggested. So I look forward to having you do this again, because I thought I was pretty well versed and I learned some stuff tonight. So thank you.
Do you or Danielle have want to make any comments to camera?
Or Sandy?
Or Sandy? Is Sandy there?
David?
Sandy's actually made some pretty insightful comments. So on the page, she had one about each time slaves made an advancement or developed their own economic systems, their accomplishments were deliberately destroyed or wiped out entirely, i.e. Tulsa, which y'all didn't even talk about. And then she made a comment about controlling access to religious training, some of that motivation, and that was something I hadn't thought about and want to look into. So yes, no, Sandy was very busy on the page tonight.
Yeah.
Yay.
So if you're ready.
Yeah, we also didn't talk about the plunder of land from the Native Americans, and that is a whole, out of Georgia, the Trail of Tears and the treaties that were broken and so on. And that is another conversation definitely to have.
That's another whole conversation.
Do you know whose land you live on?
Yeah, have you seen that?
Yes.
Yeah.
They've the last couple of conventions, they've been big on that.
Oh, CSL conventions, yeah.
CSL conventions, yes.
Yeah, we're the
All right.
Orcoquisa band basically here. Orcoquisa, and there's a Kendo, I think it is. It was a little further inland, up into Liberty County, in the 18th, up until the 18th century.
I'm on the Utes and Arapaho.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, we're going to call this whole session done and prepare for the next one. Thank you very much, PJ and Reverend Jesse, and we will see you on the flip side.
Okay, thank you.